Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and as you can probably tell, we're at a little bit of a different camera angle today, and that is because we are on NBA 2K19. Now, I didn't get the game 4 days early like a lot of other people did, and I did make that video last Friday about how this game probably won't change many things for the franchise moving forward, but I'm actually really enjoying myself through the first couple of hours I've put into it. I've only really been playing my team so far, but I'm definitely enjoying that game mode a lot more than I did last year. But what we're going to talk about today is some of the rosters and attributes throughout the game. As you guys probably know, it's a big deal every year when 2K puts out each player's individual rating, especially some of the bigger stars, and how they compare to each other. But what I'm going to be looking at today is how their individual attributes compare, and some of those that really just don't make a ton of sense in the game. Now, I understand that the developers are responsible for a ton of individual ratings, and there's a lot of things to consider to try and get that one number at the end, but there are definitely some attributes in this game that don't really make a ton of sense for particular players. Number 1, Jonas Valancunias, open three-point shot. First up, we have Jonas Valancunias and his 79 rated open three-point shot attribute. Now, I have found so far, just looking through the rosters, that 2K was pretty lenient this year about this attribute specifically, but for me, it just doesn't really make a ton of sense for Valanciunas' rating to be as high as it is when you consider some of the other players in the game. Now, when you look through the rosters, there's a lot of guys in that 78, 79, 80 range, and it's certainly difficult to quantify three-point shooting when there's so many players and they're so unique in their skill sets. But to me, it's kind of strange that someone like Valanciunas is rated the exact same as a three-point shooter as someone like Aaron Gordon. Now, if you look at their percentages from last year, JV actually did shoot better from the outside, but that obviously doesn't tell the entire story, because in terms of volume and probably difficulty of shots, things were much more difficult for Gordon, and he was also taking more of them. Now, again, I understand that it's difficult to quantify this down to one single number when there's so many different things that go into three-point percentage, but for me, it just doesn't really make a ton of sense for Valanciunas' rating to be this high when you look at some of the other guys around the rosters, even though, again, he did shoot a very good percentage from three last year. So to me, this one definitely doesn't make sense. Number 2, E'Twaun Moore and Ian Clark shot close rating. Next up is probably the strangest rating that I've found so far in terms of individual attributes in 2K19, and that's that E'Twaun Moore and Ian Clark have a 95 rated shot close. Now, on the surface, that might not seem like that big of a deal because, well, who really cares about their shot close rating? I mean, 2K has added so many different things that affect how you shoot the ball around the basket, whether it be standing layup, driving dunk, standing dunk. All those kinds of things go into it, so shot close really isn't that much of a factor. Now, I understand that, and that makes sense, but both of these guys are really known more as three-point specialists, especially Moore, so I don't really understand why their shot close rating was so high, and especially when you look at some of the other players on the rosters. When you scroll to the tab where it shows every single player in the entire game, this obviously includes all-time teams and guys at different points in their careers, Ian Clark and E'Twaun Moore have the highest shot close rating of any guards in the current form of the game, so not including all-time teams. When you're just looking at the current rosters in the NBA, E'Twaun Moore and Ian Clark have the highest shot close ratings of any guard in the entire game. This is obviously strange, but when you think about it a little bit, it makes sense because these guys have to try and make ratings that make sense across so many different players, and when you just plug and play with their attributes, sometimes the final number might not make a ton of sense, so they probably just added in a couple or maybe 10 to 15 extra points to these guys' shot close ratings to give them an overall rating that makes a little bit more sense because they're both guys in the lower to mid 70s. So that's an explanation for it, but it still definitely doesn't make sense for these guys to have ratings that high relative to every single other guard in the game. Number 3, Epke Udoh's block rating compared to Rudy Gobert's. Next up is a kind of comparison between two bigs on the Utah Jazz, Epke Udoh and Rudy Gobert, specifically looking at their block rating. Now, we all know who Rudy Gobert is. He's a perennial Defensive Player of the Year candidate, one of the best defensive players in the league, and certainly one of the best defensive bigs in the league. And then on the other hand, we have Epke Udoh, a former high pick in the draft that has bounced around to a whole bunch of different teams, but has found a little bit of a home in Utah, protecting the rim and rebounding, but really not finding very many minutes in the rotation. So you would think as you scroll through 2K's rosters that Gobert would have a very high block rating, not only on his own team, but across the entire league. But in reality, it's actually Udoh that has a 93 block rating compared to just 88 for Gobert. Now in the end, this probably isn't that big of a deal because just like with the last entry, there's just so many different attributes that go into rim protection and playing good defense as a big in 2K, but it's still just strange to see this comparison when looking specifically at their block rating. This is also probably a situation in which the developers wanted to make this as authentic of an in-game experience as possible, and seeing as how Udoh's main skill at the NBA level is rim protection, they might as well give him a high block rating so that he can do something on the court. But even with that said, it definitely doesn't make sense for Gobert's block rating to be lower than Udoh's, and maybe this is something that they'll adjust throughout the year. Number 3, Andre Roberson's free throw rating. Alright, so we all understand that Andre Roberson is not a great shooter either from the outside or from the free throw line, although he does know how to shoot his shot apparently in other areas. But coming back to actual basketball, this one definitely is still puzzling despite his shooting issues. As you can see, Roberson is rated as a 32 in his free throw attribute, and not only is that the worst on the Thunder, but it's the worst rating in the entire game, including all-time players, worse than guys like Shaquille O'Neal, Andre Drummond, DeAndre Jordan, notoriously bad free throw shooters. Roberson is worse than all of them. The only explanation I can really see for this is kind of a relative rating, because big guys aren't really expected to shoot well from the free throw line, and with Roberson being a perimeter player and his percentage still being relatively low, they decided to give him this low of a free throw rating. But as you can see, apparently 2K believes that in 2K19 at least, Andre Roberson is the worst free throw shooter in NBA history. Now, although as I said, I can kind of understand where they're coming from on this one, it still seems pretty unfair to Roberson. Number 5, Cameron Payne's open shot 3. Next up, we have Cameron Payne, a guy that had some really nice moments early in his career, but has struggled to find his niche since. But apparently, he is also the best three-point shooter on the Chicago Bulls roster, at least according to 2K19. Well, technically he's tied with Lauri Markkanen, but the point is, to me, 83 is way too high for a guy that, yes, did shoot a good percentage last year from 3, but prior to that in his career was not a good three-point shooter at all. So to just consider what is a very small sample size from last season when compared to his entire career, and then to throw this number out there as a three-point shooter doesn't make sense to me at all. Now, this is probably a situation similar to what I talked about earlier, where once all the attributes were counted up originally, Payne was somewhere in the 60s in terms of overall rating, and they didn't want it to be that low, so they brought his three-point shooting up, and that brought him up to a 71 overall. But it still just doesn't make a ton of sense to me for him to be this high, not only relative to the Bulls roster, but just in the league in general. Keep in mind that this puts him ahead of guys like Ryan Anderson and also Kawhi Leonard, who share an 82 overall rating in the same attribute category. So again, when you're looking at these things relatively, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Number 6, Trae Young, passing vision rating. Next up is an attribute that I'm honestly not really sure how it affects the actual gameplay unless you're simulating with the CPU or something, and that is passing vision. And most specifically, we're talking about Trae Young's very, very high 84 rating in that attribute. Now, if you look across the rest of the rosters, 2K is actually pretty stingy with this stat for one reason or another, but specifically if you look at guys like Steph Curry that has a 75 in this category, Young's 84 seems extremely, extremely high. Now again, just like I was talking about earlier, this is probably a situation where the developers got to the end of Steph's rating and they realized that it was higher than they wanted him to be. It's already a 95, even with his passing vision being a 75 and being a point guard. I'm sure that has a good amount to do with its overall rating. So once they got to the end, they probably brought this rating down a little bit so that he's a 95 as opposed to being something like a 98 or a 99, which is something they're pretty stingy on in this particular roster. Now, that's not anything against Young. He very likely will be a pretty good passer in the league, and he definitely showed a lot of potential in that area in college. But when you start to look at the other rosters, even some of the all-time players don't have a rating this high in this particular attribute. I mean, guys like John Wall and LeBron James have 90 plus in this category, but it's still just strange to me how close Young is even to those guys in this particular attribute. Now, I want to emphasize, as I said in the beginning, that these are very, very difficult things to put together, and it's also very easy for me to poke holes in a roster that is not only this big and complete, but also includes so many different factors and variables that go into the overall rating. So I'm not blaming 2K for any of these ratings. It's still just interesting to talk about how strange some of them are. One note really quickly before the end of the video, I'm going to do my very best to keep up with the upload schedule moving forward the rest of this week, But for those of you that don't know, I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we are supposed to be hit by what might be the worst hurricanes to ever hit the state here in the next week or so. So if I miss a Friday upload as a result of not having power or Wi-Fi or whatever, I know that you guys will understand that, but I just wanted to give you a heads up that that might be the case. Having said that, thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Tucker. This has been Sporting Logically. If you'd like to see any of my previous Monday, Wednesday, Friday videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time.